Item 8.3, African American Achievement Initiative, also to be presented by Mr. Harris and Dr. Iris Taylor.
So good evening, Board President Ryan, Superintendent Aguilar, and members of the board. My name is Iris Taylor. I'm the Chief Academic Officer, and I'm joined by Vincent Harris, our Chief Continuous Improvement and Accountability Officer, and Dr. Tiffany Smith-Simmons, who's our Human Resources Director. So we're approaching this initiative on African American achievement with the understanding that our system is perfectly designed to get the results that it gets. This statement is particularly troubling when you look at the results that we're getting for our African American students and on a number of indicators which we'll share with you tonight. Our core value calls this out and requires that we work vigilantly to confront and interrupt these inequities, the inequities that we're producing, and to level the playing field so that we can actualize our guiding principle so that all of our students graduate with the greatest number of post-secondary choices from the widest array of options. Mr. Harris shared with you this slide, and it's particularly important in relationship to this presentation because equity, access, and social justice, there's been a lot of work in the district prior, but what we bring to this particular initiative is a very specific definition of equity, access, and social justice. Tonight's presentation will center you on that second part of the definition, which is really about equity, access, and social justice as a check and balance to ensure that the practices, the policies, the procedures within the system, that we're assessing those for the extent that they are disadvantaging students within the system. So Dr. Tiffany Smith-Simmons will share with you some of that historical context that the work around equity, access, and social justice was done in previous years.
Good evening. More than 10 years ago, Sac City began exploring a variety of approaches to address the disparities found in the African American achievement data. Here are a few highlights. We developed model classrooms where teachers engaged in technical, theory, and research-based practices to create culturally responsive classrooms. We offer summer equity institutes for teachers and administrators. A small team created culturally responsive summer schools. These schools included arts and featured instructionally sound and engaging strategies that help teachers focus on the assets that every child brought to the classroom and not the deficits that often distract from instruction. The momentum was there, and the district was then launched to expand their efforts beyond these few schools. And we engaged in a partnership with Pacific Education Group. PEG helped us to refine our definition of equity and pushed many of us into unfamiliar and uncharted waters as we explored reasons why our system may be responsible for the results that we were seeing. To continue the work, we created a district equity leadership team. We produced discussion starters in the venue of 6-minute videos that were sent to school sites to provoke conversations around institutional racism and share strategies that were working in our very own classrooms. We also had a book study for administrators. There were also efforts to make policy changes. A Blue Ribbon Task Force worked to make recommendations, which led to the Equity Access Achievement Task Force and their product, a framework for eliminating the achievement gap. The district sponsored an equity fair where over 300 teachers, community members, and principals came to engage in learning. We brought nationally known scholars to engage our community of learners. Each site developed site leadership teams. Our work continues. Our recent efforts include the Achievement Gap Coalition, which led to our Restorative Justice Collaborative and their recommendations.
So as you're aware, a number of reports have been issued in recent years surrounding the disparity in outcomes for African American youth. This includes a recent report, The Capital of Suspensions, which highlights the high incidence of suspensions among African American youth in Sacramento County and SCUSD specifically. Another is a report published by the Education Trust West, Black Minds Matter, which highlights issues as well as promising practices in urban school systems in serving African American youth. And Sacramento City Unified was featured here as well for its work in its youth development department. Locally, community groups such as Black Parallel School Board and Blacks Making a Difference have issued sets of recommendations on what they believe is needed to impact achievement for African American students in the district. So Tiffany Smith-Simmons will share some of the lessons learned from previous initiatives that we want to take into future work.
As with any initiative, we definitely have some lessons learned. In reflection, despite the best intentions of many folks, and without a way to deal with the individual and organizational tensions that were brought because of the implicit bias, we're not where we want to be. We know that with anything, working in silos is not effective. Therefore, without a clear, shared agreement on what equity means and looks like, and the shifts in leadership, we struggled with keeping equity as the main thing and not just something.
So as we move forward, under the current board's leadership, as well as that of Superintendent Aguilar, new practices are emerging that we believe will help us take the lessons learned that Dr. Smith-Simmons spoke about and advance a new strategy to impact African American achievement. These include the development of a system of holistic review, where the indicators of performance for attendance, for behavior, and academic performance have been developed to create a system for early intervention and supports. These data can be aggregated across race, ethnicity, as well as student program groups. Over the past few months, we've shared with you another shift in establishing criteria for indicators of grade level readiness for K-12. Again, to assess how students are progressing academically over the course of the school year, as well as during their time within the system. We can then act in ways to keep students progressing, such as through practices like our recent implementation of the Expanded Learning Summer Program, which was an intentional strategy to intervene and increase the number of students who are progressing towards grade level readiness. We've articulated 7 priority areas of academic focus for each educational segment, elementary, middle, and high school, where there have been indicators developed to look at grade level as well as demographic groups, such as according to race, ethnicity, as well as program groups such as students with disabilities, English learners, and foster youth, for example. We're completely reconceptualizing our site and district planning and development process to ensure that our budgets align to our priorities and areas of need, and that we're able to assess the return on investment within these plans. And finally, we are applying continuous improvement principles to our work so that we are being disciplined in the decisions we make and actions we take, and continuously assessing whether or not our efforts are having the desired impact on student achievement. So for next steps, our next steps, therefore, to establish a task force that includes a wide range of representatives, such as those from academic, research, and technical backgrounds, and community members. This task force will be charged with developing a strategy that includes specific outcomes to measure on an ongoing basis. These outcomes would then be reported to the Board of Education and the community to hold the district accountable towards this end. Superintendent Aguilar convened 2 meetings with African American community leaders, one in March and another in May, that we think is building will and partnership that can be involved in this task force. The task force would meet between September through December, so a really rapid cycle of work amongst the task force so that recommendations regarding specific measurable outcomes could be presented to the board by December 20th. And then in February, by February 1st, identifying budget or organizational recommendations and impacts. So Mr. Harris will share with you the warrant for this and the why around the data that's influencing our work.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor. I think it goes without saying that both the board and community already have seen multiple data points that give pause, concern, and a sense of urgency. And so the goal here is not to suggest that you don't know what I'm about to show you. It's just to give you a framing of the multiple measures that we are going to be looking at as a district in terms of framing our needs assessment going forward. And so as we look at student achievement outcomes, obviously one of the most important measures is the SBAC. And we can see here on the slide, as we think about students that are at risk, you can see certainly the African American average results here on ELA is very low and troubling. And then also we wanted to acknowledge there are other student groups that we know we have of equal importance that we need to be tackling in terms of our special education students, our English learner, and frankly, you could say across the board, many of our students. As we look at the measure of math, the same low result. And so as I present this is not to suggest that you don't know already this unfortunate and deeply troubling result, but it's just to reaffirm that our commitment is deep in terms of changing conditions in the present for all students, but particularly our African American students. We talked about GATE in June. We have a horrifically low rate of African American students' eligibility for that. As we think about students for our specialty programs, and certainly we dealt with this as a community during the spring of this past year, and this is just a reminder of why this matters, why this is very important, and why it's mission critical for us to engage and enlist experts to help us address it immediately. Graduation rate. Here you see a little bit of a variation in terms of where African American students stand, but I think we all would agree graduation in isolation certainly is not necessarily the most meaningful measure, and the other measures I've shown you tonight, both in the SAT presentation and some of the ones right now, get at the fact that we got to make sure graduation means something, and so that's really what this slide is meant to be a call to action for. A through G completion, we know that as we think about the guiding principle, this is fundamental to it. And so there's lots of work to be done for African American students, or Native American students, or homeless students, or English learners, special education. This slide was really important at our convenings on the McClatchy conversation, and you can see, as we talked about there, in terms of the eligibility groupings, particularly Group A, we were at 0 for African American students. Again, wholly unacceptable in a district where we know 13% of our enrollment are African American students. And of course, obviously, as a community, we know that the suspension data is horrifically unacceptable. And so this just gives a framing of it within our system. And you can see where African American students stand. Frankly, you see where our foster students stand. African American students are about 35% of our foster students, so we recognize that the profile of our foster students is really something we've got to be looking at too. Along, frankly, with all of our students, because none of us accept the notion of students having behaviors that lead to suspension or expulsion. And chronic absenteeism, as we know, fundamentally, students have to show up to school. And so this is another area of deep concern for us. And again, the goal here isn't to suggest that anyone in this room didn't already know these numbers and know the disproportionality, because as Dr. Simmons shared with us, we know the district has been wrestling with this for some significant period of time. And so really tonight, we're launching the notion of we're going to be intentional and make the data visible as we get better, because we must get better. With that, I'll end there.